Hi, hello, and welcome, or welcome back, I suppose. A little break away from graphic novels this week because I need something different, and something different I most certainly got. A little fun fact about me, one of my favourite university modules, at the very least on the English literature side, was during my final year of my bachelor's, where I looked at ghost stories, particularly from the Victorian era, M.R. James, my beloved. And I note that I know little to nothing about the man himself, so if it turns out he's a wrong un, my apologies. Anyway, the point of that was to say that this made me go from enjoying to loving the ghost stories of the era. So whether I find something from then or something really reminiscent of it, I'm going to be intrigued, and my interest was very much piqued. Sorry, it's just one of my favourite little things. Anyway, it was piqued when I saw an Eddy on the Floor by Bernard Capes at my library. I wasn't sure how old this story was, if it was like an actual Victorian piece or if this was, like I said, trying to sound as such, but I looked the author up and he was born in 1854 and died in 1918. So yes, this is from pretty much exactly the era I love to seek out. The edition I borrowed also seems to have been released as part of a collection or with some illustrations by Seth. That's the only name I have, so I assume he just goes by that in a share kind of way. And it seems like they were all released as a sort of Christmas bundle, following the tradition of telling ghost stories during that season, though this one isn't set during the holidays. I feel this may be a little longer than my recent videos, though who knows. So that's enough with the preamble. I just thought that was useful information, I guess, just as a heads up as to why we're delving into something that doesn't necessarily fit with my usual reviews, because I usually review things that are a little bit more contemporary. Anyway, enough preamble, let's just get actually into it. Something you will notice from the start is the writing style, and that will likely let you know from the off whether or not this is for you. And while that's true for most, if not all, books, the older you go with fiction, the more complex it can be. I think the best way to describe this era, I guess, is that it's very formal, very proper, and I'm not very good at describing this. And there's a word that is constantly, it's when I was scripting this and when I'm relaying this to you now, my brain is not giving me the word, but it's all very proper. I'll give you the opening section just so you can see what I mean. I had the pleasure of an invitation to one of those reunions or seances at the house in a fashionable quarter of my distant connection, Lady Barbara Grill, whereat it was my hostess' humour to gather together those many birds of an alien feather and incongruous habit that will flock from the hedgerows to the least little flattering crumb of attention. Don't get me wrong, it isn't the easiest to read sometimes, and it is something that many of us have to take our time with, but I think the writing style of that era is just so perfect for ghost stories. For me, I think part of that comes down to the fact that, like I said, I do have to take my time with it. My focus is so much tighter, so all the tense moments sit so much deeper. For example, say with somebody like Junji Ito, I love him, and obviously he's an undeniable master of horror, but there is an ease to the reading itself. Yes, the visuals and the horror are upsetting in a way, and they are horrifying as they should be, but the actual reading of it is relatively simple. So it is easy to get through a Junji Ito novel relatively quickly, even the larger ones like Tomie or Geo or whatever. The complexity of the language really just elevates this kind of fiction for me in a different way. I know how pretentious I sound when I'm talking like this, and I don't mean elevates in terms of making it better. I just mean you look at the difference. I think a better comparison would be somebody like Grady Hendrix and any of the horror authors from this time, be it Capes, be it M.R. James, where while something like How to Sell a Haunted House was genuinely terrifying and the tension was high, it is very easy to read. The language is contemporary, obviously. All of his stuff is written within, I believe, the last 5 to 10 years. And you compare that with something written well over 100 years ago, encroaching on 150, we are going to see a difference. And that elevation, I just mean it, like I said, there's a sense of grandeur to it. Again, and I know I'm being a bit pretentious, but it's just like, being a bit pretentious, anyway, it just feels like something to savour. And obviously, yeah, sometimes I was having to search words up or having to like use context clues to figure out what some of it means, but there's just something about it that draws me in so much deeper with ghost stories, in particular, in terms of horror and the gothic and all that sort of thing. There's something about ghost stories from this era that I just, it tickles me. It tickles a good little spot in my brain. And sometimes you simply get to learn some wonderful turns of phrase from history, such as, I'm not trying to source you, meaning I'm not trying to kid around with you, I'm not trying to fool you, lie to you, and I love it. And it's used in a couple of, like, you can see the way that, like, the word to source as a verb is used in a couple of different ways, and I'm just like, oh, I love that. Like, one of my favourite things about reading older fiction is finding all of these little words and phrases, but I'll be honest, I think it's been quite a while since I've read anything pre-21st century. I think. And certainly everything that I've been reading has been still very much modern. And don't get me started on what modernism is. I'm not talking about that kind of modern. You know what I'm saying. Modernism and postmodernism. I did enough studying of that when I was at uni. That's not what I'm saying. Anyway, I'm rambling about with this review, but when am I not? And all I'm saying is, there's something about the language that, for me, because I have to sit with it, means that tense scenes, and when we're learning more about history in terms of, exposition. Sorry, my brain just turned off for a second there. When we're learning things about that, like, I think I do focus on it a little bit differently. Not necessarily always better, because it is still complex. I remember reading Moby Dick for the first time, and oh my god, the time that took me. I had no choice, I had to read it within 2 weeks, but it was effort. And I think that's something else, that there is something rewarding about reading something classic that is more difficult, and not everything is. Not everything that's older means it's more difficult. You know, there was popular fiction of the time, which is still going to contain some things that are a little archaic, obviously, but that's also true if you read something from the 50s. So, anyway, I think I'm meant to be talking about getting onto, like, the plot and stuff like that. But the language, it elevates things for me. But let's talk about the context of the book and the plot and that sort of thing. So our lead character is approached by someone from the party mentioned in that opening passage and is being asked to come and work at a prison as a doctor. The man who's approached him, Shrike, appears to be working on reforming the men in the prison rather than focusing on pure punishment and labour, that kind of thing, believing that if these men can better themselves, improve their self-worth, then recidivism rates will go down. Because, you know, in the way that, and he's not thinking of something as so A to B as this, but in the way that you hear about sort of skilled hackers, usually teenagers, get hired by companies and governments to use them for non-criminal, quote-unquote, means, and put their skills to, quote-unquote, good use. He's basically considering that it's like, these criminals, while they have been caught, do have a huge series of skill sets. They've just used them for nefarious means. So if we can teach them self-worth, teach them how to better use their skill sets, then perhaps when they leave, they will be able to find work rather than finding themselves back here. From what I understand, it's basically occupational therapy Victorian edition, and our lead would be the therapist, but not quite so precisely. Like, I found this whole aspect really fascinating, and were this a full-length novel rather than a short novella, I'd assume we may dive a little further into that side of things, but also that could be me just wanting to get a little more insight into that from someone living in that era. But what we did get a peek into was really interesting, and one of those things where it's like, you can see how things were starting to become what they are now. While there was a long way to go, you can see the breadcrumbs being laid out. Like, we're getting to the point of, like, lobotomies and electroshock therapy and that sort of thing. Like, that's where we're hitting. We're just before that point, I believe, here. We might have hit lobotomies by now. Perhaps. But in terms of the actual therapy, it is incredible to see that, like, the inklings of what's to come, and I thought that was really cool. I do wish we'd have had a little more of that in the prison itself, but that isn't the actual focus of the story. That is set up for why he's going to be there, and it serves as major setup for Shrike, because in going back over my notes from this initial discussion about the job offer and Shrike's intentions with it, there were so many fantastic little things laid out about sort of the difference between who Shrike portrays himself to be versus the man we sort of discover him to be later down the line. Sort of in particular, what stuck out in my notes was solitary confinement, a punishment outside all nature to a gregarious race, found no advocate in him. And the him in question there being Shrike. And seeing that again in my notes hit me like a ton of bricks, because actually, read it for yourself and see why. This is like a tickling the spoiler button, but I don't want to go all the way with it. I didn't like the way I phrased that. I'm not getting rid of it, because like I remember putting in my notes, it was just like, my notes are always initial thoughts, just writing as I go. And I was like, we could literally see at the time that solitary confinement was a dog shit tactic, and then we're still using it now in some cases, and then like finding out why that was an important line to have in at the end was just like, oh no. But when we get to the prison itself, the first person our lead is called in to deal with is a man who claims to be a medium, and he is begging to be removed from his cell and to be sent to the infirmary. He's very clearly deeply distressed and convinced that there's something going on in the cell next to him, when this man asks our lead, who's confined in the next cell? There to the left. We get the wonderfully haunting response, to my knowledge, it's empty. And this interaction is what kicks the rest of the narrative sort of into gear, and it all revolves around this seemingly empty cell. And I think the reason I find that line so kind of haunting is the to my knowledge. It's likely because I know what type of book I'm reading, and he doesn't know what kind of book he's in. I love that kind of thing. It's like a kind of dramatic irony, using the genre that you're already writing in. Or sometimes there's dramatic irony, there's like unintentional versions of that, like a book becomes popular or it's a classic. Like, this is going to be me talking about a book that I could easily talk about for days, but with Dracula, the characters, many of the characters in there seem kind of thick, but they don't know they're in Dracula. Now, yes, there are warnings ignored, especially from Jonathan, but were I him, I may heed some warnings, but I would not believe I am walking into the presence of a literal vampire. Do you know what I mean? And that's what I think, that to my knowledge, it's empty. Just had that little, oh, because that tells you what everything is going to be centered around, and that's exactly the case. And I don't want to go into too much detail as to the nature of the haunting itself, but I can say that it all works brilliantly. Like I said, I'm trying to sort of creep up to the spoiler button, but not quite, you know. We get little bites of setup throughout about the truth behind everything. No, setup isn't quite the right word, but it is explained. A lot of stuff is explained post hoc in a letter that our lead receives once the main sort of bulk of the plot is finished, and I know that as a method of exposition can be quite divisive, and as far as I can recall, it's kind of a mainstay of a lot of older ghost stories and mysteries as well. We get little pieces throughout the main bulk that we can put together, but it depends on the book as to whether they'll properly make up the full picture before the end, or whether we get enough pieces to say, like, let's say we're reading a whodunit, we may get enough pieces to figure who, but not why, or we may get that vice versa, something like that. Or sometimes you will be able to piece a full picture of yourself if you're paying enough attention, or if it's a bit too overt. But I get it. I'm not against it in theory. It definitely works here, and we do see a lot of it in classic ghost stories and detective fiction. The sort of two genres functioning in remarkably similar ways at times. I think the difference comes between whether this works or whether it doesn't is, one, the effectiveness of the reveals given to us after all the pieces we've been given. So like that line I was talking about earlier with the containment, the solitary confinement. Like, can you go back and start piecing things together, or little things start going, oh right, and that's why this and that's why that. And two, does it feel like we've still had a well-rounded story before all of the explanations? Because the ghost story we get before our lead receives the letter, helping to better explain his experiences, that story already works as a well-told tale, and the additional information we receive at the end just feels like bringing a lot of things into clarity. I get why this is a technique a lot of people aren't fans of, and for me, it's not something I will always gel with, but like I said a few times here, it's worked fantastically. Like, it can function in the same way a large exposition dump does sometimes, and they're almost always something that serves me. And they're something that almost always serves to turn me away from a book, to those large exposition dumps. So I'm glad it worked here, but I can see why people don't like them. The reveals we get about Shrike in the letter make a lot of things make sense, but we already learn to distrust him somewhat early on at our time at the prison. There's a moment where he's very quick to a temper, and he's remarkably evasive about the quote-unquote empty cell that he's not only locked shut as the other empty cells would be, but it's been bolted and screwed closed. And our lead gets a glimpse that something is haunting him, be it literally or figuratively, when in the same scene where he's quick to temper, he catches something in a mirror with Shrike. and it doesn't seem to reflect reality. And it fits together so nicely. The reveal for that particular moment happens within the main bulk of the story itself. And there was the moment just before it did go, oh, that's what I saw in the mirror. And I kind of wish it hadn't, but a lot of ghost stories do that a lot, and it is one of my pet peeves. But this is one of those things that I understand how the genre works, so I can sort of step back and go, this is a common thing. It's not about not trusting the reader. I think a lot of the times maybe it is, and maybe I should be a bit more critical of it, but it's such a mainstay, is that shock reveal, but some stuff should be left. But yeah, that reveal, that it was like just before it went, that's what I saw in the mirror, my brain went, that's what he saw in the mirror. And I would love to read this again to spot what else is hinted at and left as breadcrumbs early on that I'd missed. And if I do pick up a copy for myself rather than just borrowing it from the library again, I'll take a look at the rest of the collection too, because I believe they're all classic ghost stories, probably from about the same era. And I hope so. I think I've made that very clear. I really hope so anyway. We will probably be on graphic novels or manga again next week, I think. But stepping away from them a little bit was nice, and I think a little bit well needed as well. Do you have any fun, spooky stories you want to share? Let me know what you've been, reading in that form, especially ghost stories. And the older the ghost story. Do you have any good ghost stories I can read? I want to be scared a little bit. Most of the horror content I consume is through books in various, forms. And I love finding more. There's something almost cozy about a good ghost story. I think especially because I'm not hugely, I'm not a non-believer, but I'm not a believer either. I don't know. Would it be right to say I'm agnostic about the idea of ghosts? Anyway, feel free to like, feel free to subscribe, and feel free to ring that notification bell, all that cringe shit I'm supposed to ask you to do in my videos. But most importantly, I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful night, a wonderful whenever you are watching this. Take good care of yourself. Right.